Hi. So, yeah. Hi, everyone. And just because we're just started recording, I'm Cara Peterson from Newton Upstanders, and we're here to talk about zoning and was explaining some of the reasons we're interested in zoning has to do, of course, with racial equity and how housing goes hand in hand with inclusivity in a community like Newton, in addition to vibrancy and business development and all the good things that we need to have a vibrant and welcoming community. So we're very grateful for Deb Crossley to be here to talk us through some of the details of the zoning plans and what's happening. If you're like me, you have things to learn and are looking forward to that. So thank you so much. And I will hand it off to our good friend, Deb Crossley, who is here to tell us all about zoning, and we really appreciate your time. So off to you, Deb.
Well, thank you so much, Cara and Laura and Adam in particular for helping me manage the PowerPoint. I had a colleague once who said something in the order of power corrupts and PowerPoint corrupts absolutely, which I always thought was pretty funny because it is a pretty engaging medium. But before I start using it, actually, you could put the first slide on because it's just a pretty picture. Because I think Adam is managing the slide. Got that. So I'm just going to lay out Upstanders asked me to cover some specific things. It was at first a conversation outside an event with Laura and Cara asking me to explain the Village Center Overlay District to a wide range of folks, some of whom may know something about it, some of whom may not. And then they really do their homework. So they sent me an outline of what they want me to cover. And it ranges from, and I'm going to keep this part really short, a few state statistics, a little bit about history. Really, I'm going to keep this short too. A little bit about the history of what zoning is and what it is in Newton, our goals, how we are incorporating our understanding of Newton's history, about the district itself and what some of it could look like, the MBTA Communities Act and the relationship to this project, where we are in the scheme of things and what this can do for our city. So I'm going to begin with the statistics, the regional statistics. Next slide. Next slide, please. Oh, can I do that? No. Next slide.
No,
please.
sorry, Deb. I had everybody up because I was like trying to go through. There's just some participants I needed to mute. But
okay.
We're good. I just happen to be at the same time.
So Newton is not alone in facing a housing crisis or the climate crisis or transportation issues, or suffering local economies or suffering state economies. But a lot of it does come back to housing. I was able to take a few slides from a woman named Chris Kluckman, who's one of the executive directors at what used to be called the Department of Housing and Community Development. They have a new name, but you get the idea. They are in charge of administering the MBTA Communities Program, which I'm going to talk about later. But this slide just shows how little housing relatively over the last 30 years Massachusetts has created. And it is absolutely not keeping pace with demand. You can see a big change around 1988, 1989, 1990, which is typical of communities across the Commonwealth, when zoning ordinances became much stricter pretty much across the board. People were using zoning ordinances to limit the number of people who come in their communities. Next slide, please. So related to that, very much so, is if you look at Massachusetts, the red bar across typical home values and 2-bedroom rent estimates as of July of 2022, you can see that Massachusetts is the fourth from the top of highest, most expensive communities to live in relative to housing. And this is directly related to lack of supply. Next slide, please. So in Newton, we have some statistics you just might want to keep in mind. Approximately 33,000 housing units from the 2020 census exist, 58% of which are single family. Only 672 units in 10 years up until 2020, which compares a very low rate even against our state, which I just said is already down on production. You see a little bump in 2019. That's the opening of the Austin Street and followed by the what's now called TRIO projects, 68 and 140 units together, and a few other smaller projects. But we're not doing so well since then. Despite all the projects that have been permitted, we are now in a bit of a freeze position since COVID. So those are the regional and local statistics. Next slide, please. In order to talk about the subject before us, there are 3 definitions that are really important for everyone to absorb. We're going to talk about what by right construction means versus special permit. By right doesn't mean you can do anything you want. It means that you don't need to go before either the city council or the zoning board of appeals for special permission. You don't need a public hearing and a public process weighing in on what you can do. Instead, you have to follow all the rules of the zoning ordinance that are on the books, which includes a long list of things from stormwater, construction management, conservation, affordable unit requirements, historic commission, etc. And you have to follow the Mass Building Code. And in our new Village Center Overlay District, which I'm going to explain in a bit, there's a lot of rules built in. So it's by right as long as you follow the rules. We have this other permitting process in our zoning ordinances. It's what's allowed by special permit under specific circumstances. And as long as you do no harm, and again, follow the rules, but it is also subject to a public hearing, and it is also discretionary, decided finally by the city council. So those 2 things are really important to understand. Multifamily housing. There's still some confusion over what that means. We have multi-residence districts in Newton. In those districts today, we're only allowed to have 2 family by right. The definition of multifamily, which is also in our state code and understood as a term of art, is 3 or more separate households on a parcel or in a building. So, next slide, please. I'm only showing one map from 1953 because I wanted to keep this tight. Our zoning started in 1921 in Newton, and we allowed 6 stories and 80 feet by right in many of our districts. We allowed multifamily in many of our districts by right, 3 or more units. In 1953, that was the first major change of our zoning, and we further limited by right multifamily housing only to certain residential districts and kept it in 1 business district. So that was still about 4 different districts and fairly extensive. Also in 1953, the height was reduced, the allowed height was reduced a little bit from 6 stories and 60 feet, from 6 stories and 80 feet to 6 stories and 60 feet. Not that big of a change. And at the same time, of course, our community was beginning to expand post-World War II. So the expansion was rampant in the 60s and 70s. By 1987, the city leaders made huge changes, perhaps as a reaction to the amount of residential development that was happening, perhaps as a reaction to certain buildings that were built at the time that people didn't like. But they did two huge things that have caused some of what we are seeing today. They totally eliminated the ability to create multifamily housing, 3 or more units by right. They all now require a special permit, but they're not allowed at all in the business districts, which are what form the core of our village centers. And at the same time, they reduced the by right in our village centers, which could now only be business, retail or commercial uses, to 2 stories and 24 feet. These are huge changes. I moved here in 1985, joined the League of Women Voters right away to get to know my community, and they were following land use issues. Didn't hear a word about this. So I just think that's very interesting to look at, because remember that earlier chart that shows that, a large amount of, a large decrease in housing production as of around that time. Next slide, please. So this I don't expect you to read all of this, but this is the cataloging of all the different changes in the zoning ordinances. 1939 was just a mapping. It was just moving around some of the zones. And the 1987 to 24 feet. And in the residence district, they reduced the height a little bit, but the real thing was that there's no more multifamily allowed. And then here also is the proposed village center overlay district. But I'm going to give you that in a visual. Next slide, please. So we have some big challenges facing Newton, as does our state and our nation. Lack of housing options. It's become pretty severe over the decades. Our businesses are struggling. We know they were competing with box stores. Now they're competing with online retail. There's high turnover. There's empty storefronts. The rents have gone up, and it's a struggle, except in a few places in our city where there's a lot of residential development close by. Climate change. Climate change, it was the Sierra Club who came out with a statement recently about how significant our community development patterns have been and will be in moderating our use of energy and resources. And so our development patterns by themselves, you build closer together, near public transit goods and services. That's how you use less. Transportation and traffic issues have to be tackled at the same time. We want to be able to age in place and welcome new families, but we don't have enough housing to do either of those things. And something that came up big time in the community, lack of space to gather and socialize. Every one of these village centers, we want to be wonderful places to gather, meet your friends, do a little business, and so forth. Next slide, please. So these slides, of course, are either taken from one of our staff's presentations or a state presentation or somewhere else and pieced together. But so this one was presented at our most recent public hearing, showing modifications to each of the 3 districts. But we have something called the Village Center Overlay District, which I'm going to describe in a minute, where we say, hey, our village centers are unique. And so right now we have a one-size-fits-all zoning. Remember, business and commercial only, 2 stories only, no housing units. There's some existing housing units, no new housing units. That's not working very well. So we came up with these 3 districts. Back and forth, there's a lot of iterative design that went on here. The densest district would allow in our village centers, called VC3, 4.5 stories by right. And we limit the size of the footprint or the ground floor of the building as a way to manage scale. Those are the key elements. The half story can either be set back as it is in the VC3, or it can be a pitched roof, as you see in VC2. VC2 steps down to 3.5 stories. These two districts lay over our business districts. I'm going to repeat that later. So we have our existing business districts in the village center, and then we're going into the immediate surrounding residential areas, not very far away, easy walking distance. Multi-residence transit is at the same scale, 2.5 stories, as our residential districts, but allows more units. So we'll leave it at that for now. Next slide, please.
Sorry, one sec.
Okay, you're better at this than I am.
Yeah, I know. Famous last words here. I lost. Oh, it's with it's with.
The next one is buildings allowed by right over time.
I'm just gonna. Oh, found it! Yay!
I'm seeing the first slide. Can you go down to slide 10? There we go. Okay, so we've paid a lot of attention not only to the patterns of development in our city, which are unique. We good? Where's it going?
Sorry.
What are the existing buildings that we love or that we have, if we don't love them, throughout the city? Even though 6 stories were allowed by right for most, the better part of the century, in the 1900s, these are the kinds of buildings that got built. So you can see in all of our villages, even in Upper Falls, which is the smallest village, this is the end of a block of historic buildings, is 4 stories. The one in West Newton is a landmark building. These are buildings that were allowed to be built, and some of which still exist in our city centers. Some, however, have been torn down. So I show this to you because the next slide, if we can go to the next slide, is a simple graphic illustration of where we've been from 1922 to 80 feet, 1953, 60 feet, 1987, 24 feet, to this 69 to 71 feet, 4.5 story building. By the way, the half story is either under a sloped roof, just like in our residential districts, we're allowed up to 2.5 stories, which means you're under the eaves, and you can pop dormers into that to get some little more living space up top. Or in the business district, it has to be set back from the front or any exposed elevation by 10 feet. Basically so that you're experiencing the building from a particular height at the eave. But if you look at this, we're kind of trying to recover what was once allowed in our central business districts in order to create more vitality. Next slide, please. So this village center overlay district, the overlay district needs to be defined. It's an area of land where the zoning, which is basically a book of rules, the new zoning is layered over the existing zoning. So there are 2 sets of rules that any property owner may choose in order to improve their existing home or business or to build new on their parcel. They have to choose one or the other. You can't mix them. And generally the overlay district conveys additional property rights. It doesn't take anything away. Next slide, please. So how does this work? I believe in a little bit of repetition. So again, the two zones overlay the village business district. VC2 allows up to 4.5 stories, stepping down to VC3, which allows up to 3.5 stories. I'm going to go to the next slide, please, because it zeroes in a little bit. And I want to explain some of what's on this map. This is the entire city of Newton. The concentric circles are showing a 1/2 mile radius and a 1/4 mile radius from the center of the village, which is often marked by the train station or the Green Line station. That's because of the law we need to comply with, but also for our own sake, we've been talking for a long time about creating walkable villages. 5-minute walk is generally a 1/4 mile, 10-minute walk, generally a 1/2 mile. So that's what we're talking about. You can see right now, we're pretty much staying within that 1/4 mile. You can see all of Newton's villages labeled here, and what's underneath them is the existing zoning. So the faded zones are the existing zoning. And again, we're laying, the red zone is VC3, the blue zone is VC2, so 4.5 stories, 3.5 stories, laid over the business district, pretty much. And the green is something called multi-residence transit. That's where we are keeping the scale the same as the residential neighborhoods that it is overlaying. So that owner has a choice between their existing zoning, whether it's two residences by right, or if it's in a single family district. Most of them are in multi-residence districts already. And you get to choose those 2 different sets of rules. In total, this is taking up, you see where the bright colors are, is taking up about 3% of the city land area. If you look at those parcels against the total 18.2 miles of the city. The areas we're not touching, I think, are worth mentioning. You see those hatched areas. Those are Newton's 4 historic districts: Newtonville, Auburndale, Newton Upper Falls, and Chestnut Hill, which is the largest one. I believe Newton Upper Falls was the first. I think somebody's not muted. Okay.
Yeah, 1 second.
So okay. So what we have done to get to version 3 is we, in committee, and many councilors have been coming to our committee to weigh in, particularly as it impacts their district. And many boards and commissions and citizens groups have been as well, to go pretty much parcel by parcel and examine, okay, how does the new zoning fit here? How does it transition there? What's on the ground? So the 3rd iteration of this reflects that much work. Okay, whoops. If I want to go to the next slide, but I also want to mention to Adam that the slide after that is still sideways. So I don't know if there's anything you can do about that, but let's go to the next slide, because it just zeroes in on, in this case, West Newton. Just because it shows a little bit more detail, I wanted to show it. Most of us are familiar with West Newton. You see where those black lines are? Those are places where we determined, which were business zones before, and now we're going to be the VC3, where we determined these areas must have retail, commercial uses, active uses on the ground floor. If we don't have active uses on the ground floor and allow residential to be top to bottom, our villages are going to be really sleepy. So the proverbial bedroom community. So those are required ground floor active uses. The light green in the middle is city property. Just wanted to point that out. It's a tiny park and the police headquarters building. You see city property also between Davis Street and Chestnut Street. And then along Washington Street going out toward the T. That big red mark that is VC3, which counts for a lot of potential units, is over MBTA land. That's the MBTA parking lot. So that actually would require a little more work than the by right zoning we're talking about. So all of these districts that you're seeing in the bright colors are offering a certain amount of by right zoning. Okay, next slide, please. Oh, you fixed it. It's just wrong on mine. Okay, excellent. So we did all kinds of studies. We did economic analyses to understand, you know, what's feasible. If we didn't allow enough building, we wouldn't get anything. If we didn't have the right set of rules, we might not get anything. But we don't want too much either. That's going to overwhelm the scale. So again, we're not offering as much as was offered in the past. And we're offering about the same as many of the buildings we see. But this is a view looking up Lincoln Street, Newton Highlands, from the church grounds. So it's we asked our consultants, our outside consultants, to do accurate perspective drawings. So these are measured drawings as the eye sees them. And you see on the right, the existing 3-story building and the public plaza. And by the way, no public land is going to be diminished as a result of this. It all stays public land and open space. And on the left, the 1-story sort of mall that has replaced formerly larger buildings. The outline of the building in the back is an historic building called the Stevens Building. That's a rather large building on the corner of Lincoln and Walnut. Next slide, please. So this is the same measured rendering with the existing building on the right and the plaza staying the same. This actually, in the new work, certain of the design standards that are incorporated require a minimum 12-foot sidewalk. So if we have only 8-foot sidewalks, they have to step their building back. It gives maximum heights of the ground floor story of each story above that. As I mentioned earlier, roof shapes can either be a pitched roof at a certain maximum pitch with dormers, or stepped back from the cornice line at the 4th floor. And the ground floor has to have a certain minimum amount of glazing in it, transparency for those active uses, and a minimum ceiling height, floor to floor height on the ground floor of 15 feet. We also incentivize things like bay windows and balconies and dormers by not counting them toward the maximum allowable floor area of the building, which is related to what we call the footprint on the ground floor. So we did a number of these. I'm only showing you these two. And I'm going to go to the next slide, please. So, like I said, there's a lot of design standards incorporated into the ordinance, and we can talk more about those. But a big question is, well, how does this provide housing that's affordable? And you might add, and to whom? So there's two ways. By allowing extra density in compact, minimum units per acre, developments near public transit and goods and services that are walkable. We are doing two things. First of all, the city has what's called an inclusionary ordinance that requires that a certain percentage of units be deed restricted so that they are affordable to folks earning lower incomes, specifically between 50 and 80% of the regional area median. And it has to average at 65. We, the city of Newton, have to submit an economic feasibility analysis when we may use this. I'm going to get last to MBTA communities because we're really doing this for ourselves and for our villages. And then we want to satisfy MBTA communities. But we have to submit the analysis. We've done this before. We did it at Trio. We did it at Austin Street, at Riverside, at Northland. We know we can get the units built when we require this number of units to be deed restricted as affordable. So you see in this chart to the right, upper right, the percentage of units changes a little bit as you get into higher unit counts. We last reviewed this ordinance and did an economic analysis on it in the end of 2019. The second way we achieve housing that's affordable, but affordable to middle income folks, is in how we are incentivizing more smaller units. Right now, our city zoning ordinances enable gigantic homes. Now, if I think we have a lot of these gigantic and large homes. I have two 30-something kids. We can talk more about this and make it personal, but I know most of my friends' kids can't afford to come back to Newton on their own unless they're living with us. Even if they have good jobs, even if they're two-parent working families or just a two couple with good jobs, they can't afford the ticket price to Newton. And they're living smaller. They're living smaller, sometimes in Boston, sometimes in surrounding communities, if they want to stick around. And in the multi-residence transit zone, we're allowing two different things. This is in those houses. Like, I think always of Lincoln Street because it's close by to me. Lincoln Street in Newton Highlands has a lot of big old Victorians and colonials, large with big yards. It's a block or 2 blocks from the village center. And the people who live in those neighborhoods from, actually 10 blocks always do walk to the village center. But these big homes have now 1 or 2 people in them, maybe 3, in many, many cases. So the families that inhabit these big homes are smaller. And the houses, to incentivize keeping the existing homes, and there's a huge incentive for this, we would allow under this zoning by right expansion of your home toward the rear to add 50% more. So if you have 1,000 square foot footprint, you get another 500 square feet and so on, times the height of the house. And you must have at least 3 units if you're going to be allowed to do this. You may have 4, 5, or 6 units if you can fit them. Alternatively, in the MRT zone, if you are going to tear a house down, you may only have a maximum of a 1,500 footprint, period. You may have a maximum of 4 units times the 2.5 stories. So there's more incentive for renovation and addition, depending on the circumstances and the condition of the building, of course. But, we're seeing a lot of perfectly good buildings coming down that we don't like to see. In the VC zones, and of course, those would be smaller units because you're cutting up an existing home and you're getting a limited footprint. So these would be small units. In the VC zone, there's no limit to the number of units. So let's say you have a 10,000 square foot building. You can have, you take away 20% for, your stairs and your hallways and so forth. So maybe you wind up with 10 800 square foot units or a mix of something else. But it's generally more lucrative for a developer. So here's the incentive to have more separate units than fewer large units when you get to have them. So those are the incentives and the requirements. Let's see. Next slide, please.
And hey, Deb, just a
Yeah.
quick time check. We are at 8:07 p.m. And I know we have a lot of people interested with questions.
Okay, I'm going to go quickly through MBTA communities. I'll let that be a question. Sorry.
Great. No, all good.
Okay, so what is the MBTA communities law? Newton is one of 177 MBTA communities. We are labeled as a rapid transit community because we have both commuter rail and Green Line. And that means we have to enable a larger unit capacity, which I'm going to define in just a second. And the unit capacity for Newton is 8,330. So next slide, please. So what is unit capacity? It's not the number of units that actually could be built or would be built. So it's not a build-out analysis. It is a measure as determined by the MBTA communities, the MBTA compliance formula of multifamily units that the zoning allows as of right in the district, but you cannot count what's on the ground. You don't count existing units. You just figure out how many multifamily units could be allowed as of right if the parcel were vacant. The formula also assumes that they're all small units. You divide your absolute potential building square footage by those dimensional requirements I gave you before by 1,000 square feet, which means 800 square foot units. So if you're going to have 1,600 square foot units, you cut that number in half, but the formula counts them as 1,000 square feet. And it assumes no space taken by parking. So because we subtract, the formula overestimates the number of units that can be built. Okay, next slide, please. Next slide, please. Thank you. So as of right zoning in the MBTA communities law also allows something called site plan review. We have set a threshold for what would still require a special permit to less than 3/4 of an acre site. But site plan review is for anything 20,000, a lot 20,000 square feet or over. And it can be very effective in making sure that a project is well designed, that the site transportation and circulation and all that sort of thing works well within the requirements. And some people also ask about what about energy efficiency in our special permit process. We have been able to require a high degree of high performance building standards, but we have adopted in Newton the most stringent codes possible, which are really top of market. The optional specialized energy code was adopted and it's effective as of January 1st, 2024. Next slide, please. So this is really just two slides. A couple slides I'm going to wrap up. How is this going to be good for Newton and why do people care about it? We've had a very extensive engagement process. And if you're not one of the people who thinks this is the cat's meow, you may not feel as good about this, but we have had many over the 3 years, the first year almost in its entirety, second year, lots of public forums and public speaking in our meetings and lots of write-in individual conversations, office hours, and so forth. We've gotten a lot of feedback and it has informed our progress substantially. Next slide, please. So we believe that the benefits to the city are going to address and help to solve some of the problems that we are facing, some of the challenges, that we'll get new housing options. We can talk about how many. that will have some less expensive options by virtue of having smaller units, that will have, it will get some new affordable and accessible housing by our rules, that this will provide customers more feet on the street ready customers upstairs and from, an easy walking distance to our small businesses. And we do have sufficient city services, but I'm going to let you ask me about that because there's a lot to talk about. Next slide, please. So, oh, nope, there should be one more. I had a slide number 23. Maybe it went away.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. That's okay. I'll stop. And, the next slide was basically saying our deadline for compliance with the MBTA communities law is the end of this calendar year. And to comply, we can only use, actually, I was corrected today, it's 5 of our 12 villages may be used to comply with our MBTA communities requirements, because 5 of them have 2 things. They have public transit and they have at least 5 contiguous acres, and we have to have both. Okay. I think I'm going to introduce Rob Gifford, who's here with us today, who is a member of Newton for Everyone, and is going to talk about a coalition of residents who have banded together in support of this and why.
Thanks, Deb. Yeah, hi, it's Rob Gifford here. I think I'm unmuted. Can you all hear me or?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yes. So I'm a 35 years or more Newton resident and have been very active in a variety of initiatives, and probably nearest and dearest to my heart is exactly what the City Council is tackling now, which is how do we create more housing options for everyone, at different income levels and different stages of life. And also, how do we make our village centers more vibrant to create great environments for activities, for retailers, to really have nice happening village centers. So that's a real something that's very near and dear to my heart. And one thing I just sent out, actually, somebody in the chat had asked about what are the city councilors' positions who are in competitive races. And I encourage people to go to another group I'm involved with, which is called Voters for a Vibrant Newton, which endorses candidates in contested races who favor, more housing, vibrant village centers, sustainability, et cetera. So that will give you a sense of who we're endorsing. Deb is obviously top of our list. I think what the council is doing now is so incredibly important. I mean, we've been fighting this battle for 20 years, and this is the seminal moment to rezone the village centers in the way that is, recommended now after much work and public input and great planning that Deb has just summarized for everybody here. The folks who oppose this, who are generally hostile to any sort of density or additional housing, are very vocal. They are determined, and they always show up. And we need to counteract that. We need to support the city council in doing this. We need to have our councilors backs, plural, as they go through this, because there's a lot of resistance. As I think my sense is, based on the comments on the chat, folks here get this and are excited about it. There's a very vocal, I think minority, but very vocal segment of Newton that really does not agree with this vision. And so what we've sort of created this really over the last couple of weeks as a coalition of different groups in Newton. Currently, it includes the Newton Interfaith Clergy, Green Newton, Building Standards Committee, Engine 6, the Charles River Regional Chamber, and other groups are getting on board that will get out there and show that there are a lot of people in Newton, hopefully a majority of active and engaged people who are very much in favor of what the council is proposing here. And as opposed to the kind of the NIMBY position, and you'll see these signs around Newton where it's save our villages, and it's this, you know, scary image of 8 and 9-story buildings with a big, you know, hash mark through them. We're taking the more positive approach, which is yes for Newton's villages. We want this to be a welcoming community. We want this to be a community that provides great housing alternatives in village centers and elsewhere for young families, for seniors, for all sorts of people. So that's really our vision. And so what we're trying to do is to activate folks, to get them informed as to what is really being proposed here, and to encourage people to show up and show their support for this incredibly important reform and village center overlay district initiative that's now underway. It's by far the most important and impactful thing that has happened on this front for as long as I've been active on this in these areas in Newton. So that's what we're about. Would love it if the Upstanders would join our coalition, but I'll let you guys come to that determination. But in any event, would encourage folks who are on this call and like what they're hearing from Deb and like that vision to visit our website, visit the Voters for a Vibrant Newton website as to who we're endorsing, and sort of get on board to the extent that this is an initiative that's exciting to you and is a positive vision for the future of Newton.
Thank you so much, Rob and Deb, for that amazing presentation. There's so much excellent information in there. And I see there are so many questions. And there were also a lot of questions that were submitted when people RSVP'd. So we just looked through them and, kind of pulled out some of the major themes from the questions that people submitted. And I'm trying to pull in what people have submitted here as well. So we're going to do as many as we can. But please continue to put questions in the chat, and whatever we don't get to in the next 40 minutes or so, we will hopefully be able to get out to you guys in a FAQ or an email or something afterwards. But I think one of the things that keeps coming up is that people are really concerned that the new zoning is going to encourage unfettered growth by large developers. So can you just speak a little bit about what the checks are that are in place to make sure the developers don't have free reign over our city? Deb.
There we go. Sure. I want to recognize that President Susan Albright is here with us, and so maybe she would like to chime in at some point. She also serves on the Zoning and Planning Committee, of course. So I want to say first and foremost that I hope we will get some development. Development is opportunistic. It requires either a property owner who wants to improve their property or wants to redevelop or wants to sell. It requires an existing condition that is worth rebuilding. We're not going to rebuild over Austin Street or Trio, but those are included in the district. We're not going to rebuild over most churches and temples and the landmark buildings that are protected. The reason they're included in the district is because we want to offer them a range of by right uses. And I personally, we don't have a number. It's because there's so much guesswork in this. Some of our counselors and others are using the MBTA compliance formula, which, if you didn't get that before, does not give you an accurate number of what is going to be built. It gives you it's just a compliance number. It doesn't even tell you what could be built. It assumes all the sites are vacant. So if we get, I don't know, 20% of this, of what we're enabling over the next couple of decades, maybe 3, we're looking for this development. Somebody in the chat said, hey, why aren't we expanding these districts? Why are they so small? Why aren't we expanding, allowing it to go beyond 3% or so of the city land area? This is a big step for Newton. And we're starting with the areas of the city I think are most critical to give a boost. But there actually have been quite a few people who have written in asking, in particular, why don't we expand the MRT district? I don't think there's going to be, there can't be all this development at once. And it's pretty modest, really. These are the smaller sites that are going to be allowed by right. Like I said, if the site is 30,000 square feet or more, which is a little less than 3/4 of an acre, it goes to a special permit process, that long protracted process, which is often subject to litigation because the council's decision is subject to litigation. So I think it's alarmist to imagine that we're going to get more than we can handle.
Okay, so I guess, can you just say quickly how you think the overlay zoning is going to really improve our villages?
Yeah, as tried to sum up at the end there, I think bringing housing into our village centers and immediately surrounding is creating those walkable villages that are have been shown to be very successful in other communities and across the country at balancing the uses. So we're really looking for, I'll spin this off some of our opponents. We're looking for the right density and the right mix of uses and at the right scale so that it's also a pleasant, enjoyable environment, the right balance, and the right level of investment in our village centers so that they do not continue to decline.
So another question that seems to be coming up a lot, and you touched on this a little bit, is why Newton is going beyond the minimum unit capacity required by the MBTA communities. Why shouldn't we just slow down and see what the impacts are first and then expand it?
Yeah, well, I think that's likely to be an argument you're going to hear on the floor of the council as we continue to debate this issue. It's no secret there are 9 councilors who asked us to do just that. And what that means, and I'm going to say why first from my perspective, is that I think this is a long needed revision. Since the days of Mayor Cohen, and he seated the Comprehensive Planning Advisory Group, the council adopted a comprehensive plan in 2007. Mayor Sarah Warren ran on it, along with running on the Blue Ribbon Commission results. 2 mayors, a board of aldermen, all said, we need to fix the zoning. And so here it is, 2023. All we've done, in 2015, we re-adopted our zoning by cleaning it up so you could read it. We've made some important advances we've adopted an accessory apartment ordinance that is very progressive. We have improved the inclusionary zoning ordinance. We adopted an ordinance that you can only get by special permit, but it's called mixed use 4, where mixed use is incentivized. And a couple of developers have used that zoning and to good effect. But this is, relatively speaking, nibbling around the edges. If we want to give this opportunity to all of our villages and we need the housing, we should not take some villages out of the mix, because doing so means we keep 5 villages in the compliance application and we eliminate 7 or some number of the rest of the 7, or wait for the 7. Why? I'm not sure why we would wait, but that's me.
I guess I've also just heard a lot of people wondering about how we're going to deal with this huge influx of new buildings and new people. How are our schools going to manage? How would you respond to those questions about whether our city is ready for this kind of big change?
So starting shortly after 2010, with a new mayor and new members of the Board of Aldermen at the time, the city began strategic planning, which it had never done before. By 2013, there was a strategic plan to rebuild and renovate all of our elementary schools, and then it included the preschool as well. We've been at that steadily, and we have grown capacity in our school system. We also initiated strategic planning for infrastructure projects, which includes our water systems and our roads and sidewalks. And those are pretty far along the way, particularly the sewer system is, you don't know because it's underground unless it's backing up into your basement. You don't know how bad it was. So we've added capacity to those systems. We've added capacity to our school system. The high schools are crowded today because it's a wave of kids coming through the schools. But we're talking at the same time because our elementary school enrollments have declined about 1,300 or so students in the last few years. We're talking right now about the possibility of closing an elementary school. So that's not good for those neighborhoods. And once that's done, it's done. So we've been told over the last number of years, maybe 5 years, that the new development we've been permitting is necessary to keep kids in our schools, and that they weren't, they're not bringing in enough kids. So, and we're not seeing a lot of new families come into Newton if there's not housing that's affordable to them, either as a starter home or a step up or whatever. There just isn't opportunity for a lot of families to come in.
So this next question is a big one, and there also has been some questions in the chat about it. So this is about affordability, and I think most people in Newton support more affordable housing. So I think you mentioned it in your presentation, but can you talk a little bit more about how this is going to help with affordability, and touch on why we can't just build purely affordable housing?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'm going to say this plan does not solve every problem. And it isn't enough to get to, it doesn't even touch what I might call true affordability, really low, super low income families. And we have that in Newton. That requires bringing in other resources along with this. This is really looking at the two things I mentioned by having more smaller, more diverse types of housing. You can begin to provide supply for middle income families. We're at the high end in the state, we're at the high end in the country. So what that means is less than it might mean in Tennessee. But here we are, and we have a median income home price of $1.6 million. Could we cut that in half, or a little more than half, with a small unit in a 3-family home or multifamily condo or rental? That's going to take a good deal of supply, but I think that's the direction we want to go. If we do nothing, we won't get that. And the other way is that these larger projects will bring deed restricted units affordable to low and moderate income folks between that 50 and 80% area median income. It also brings something else called workforce housing. So a lot of young cadets in the police force and first time up firefighters and teachers and so forth don't qualify for the more deeply subsidized housing, but they qualify for the workforce housing as a way to get started. It's not the total solution. We're not pretending that it is. We're very far behind on supplying housing, and certainly at all levels of affordability.
Thank you. So I guess a lot of what people are saying who are opposed to the new zoning is that it's going to change Newton. And I just wanted you to address how you think Newton is likely to change if we keep only our current zoning in place. So in other words, what are the risks of leaving the zoning as it is now?
Further decline, further, more families that can't afford to live here. It's not good for our community. It's not healthy for a community to not be able to regenerate and bring new generations in. All our kids aren't going to want to come back and live here. But my 30-something kids and many of their friends have tried to come back here and they couldn't. And some have moved out of state. There's a huge exodus of young professionals out of Massachusetts. Even if they keep working here, they're living in neighboring states. And there's statistics on that, but I don't dare repeat them. But 2 of my kids are 2 of those statistics. So but it's not an unusual story. So it's not healthy for a community to have so few options for the next generation. Never mind for us, for those of us who would like to perhaps pass our house along to the next generation, and there's nowhere to go. So the supply is really short, super short. The state says, if I didn't say this earlier, that we need to not enable, but actually build 200,000 units in the next 10 years in the state of Massachusetts to keep the economy from sliding. And the real estate professionals at a recent chamber presentation, which I took some of these slides from, when asked, okay, so what's going to really begin to affect the price of housing? And they said the rental market is the most sensitive to supply and demand. If it becomes more of a buyer's market than a seller's market, you'll see the rental prices going down first. And they said, we're thinking it's more like 250 to 400,000 units that have to be put on the market for that switch to happen across the state. And of course, we haven't talked much about transportation, but I don't know if somebody wants to ask about that because it has to be tackled at the same time.
Actually, it'd be great if you can just say a few words about transportation, because
Yes.
So,
I know people, oh, go ahead.
The constant refrain that we hear also from our opponents, and they're not wrong, is the quality of the Green Line and the quality of the commuter rail. Our mayor and council president and our state delegation and our congressman are working hard to do a full court press with the state to get that money available for rebuilding the 3 stations along the commuter rail. If we aren't successful with complying with MBTA communities, at least, there's a long line of people competing for those monies. We have federal money identified. I'm not sure where it stands right now because we weren't able to match it with the state money. But those things need to happen. The Green Line's getting new trains pretty soon. They've repaired all the tracks. So it might be a matter of people feeling comfortable getting back on it. I don't know. High-speed rail is something our state needs. 60% of the traffic that goes east-west is through traffic coming through Newton. So we're off balance. So people who are concerned about traffic, they're not wrong either, but it's mostly not coming from us.
So thank you so much. I'm going to jump in with a little pivot on questions, if that's okay, just to focus a little bit more on our business community, in particular, our small business community, and thinking about how some of these zoning changes will affect, hopefully for the better, some of our businesses. And just as a non sequitur, I did see someone is looking to start a water taxi in Watertown, a kayak to work kind of business. They have those in Paris. They're very cool. Okay, so there's a couple questions with sort of the same flavor. So really the folks are asking 2 things. One is, how will these zoning changes really help the small businesses in Newton, not the giant box stores, but our small businesses who are struggling to sometimes survive. And the flip side of that, or in the same vein, is how can these zoning changes help protect some of our, longtime businesses that are really part of the community and so important to our vibrancy as a city?
Well, the short answer is, unfortunately, the zoning can't help protect our existing businesses if they're renting and their landlord decides to redevelop and doesn't help with relocation.
Right. Okay.
A longer answer is we're actually looking into some things to see if there's a way to be of assistance. There certainly are stories, and this was the case with the Trio development, where the developer actually helped significantly in relocating the few housing units that pre-existed and a couple of the businesses. But businesses do move around. all of, say, Newton Center isn't going to get rebuilt at once. So if one, let's say the Walgreens gets rebuilt, well, that's actually a vacant building for over a year now. So it's a prime site for redevelopment. Or those couple of blocks in Lincoln, on Lincoln Street, which do have shops in them, but you know, some are chains. But if we're talking about the small mom and pop businesses, one thing redevelops opens up new first floor retail space. You know, can businesses move over if another one's going to? Some of the places are unlikely to redevelop, like the 3-story building in Newton Highlands on the south side of Lincoln Street. Lots are really tiny and shallow and up against the T, and it's going to be pretty tough puzzle to try to redevelop those at all. And they're already 3 stories. So,
and you know, it's interesting because like you think about the zoning rules generally, right? And how those won't maybe directly impact business, but certainly having better housing and more people around and more potential customers walking around in the streets, that's gonna have a spillover effect that's obviously really good for
it's
businesses.
the only way to compete with online shopping. If they can't pay the rent because they don't have enough customers, we're going to have fewer and fewer goods and services. We've already, in my 38 years here, I've seen my village of Newton Highlands and Upper Falls and noticed Newton Center, all of which I frequent. You know, there's a sharp reduction in the diversity of goods and services, right? There's an awful lot of, as we say, banks and nail salons. Not sure how that works for the nail salons, but apparently it does. And, you know, we have a few new bakeries and that's great. But there's also been a large number of new, you know, eateries that haven't lasted very long.
You need more foot traffic.
Yeah, you just need more humans.
Desperately.
Yeah.
You know.
Well, yeah, and it's interesting because when I moved to Newton, it was 1,000 years ago, like actually 20 years ago in Newtonville. I mean, just look at how much that has changed. You know, there was the parking lot where there's now the cafe, and it's the 2 cafes. And it's kind of funny because that's also the favorite spot of the city councilors to hang out and get signatures. So I don't know where y'all used to go, but and now that's the perfect spot. Related, but sort of somewhat related, but also unrelated. When you think about sort of the interesting ways to think about zoning and the effect that it'll have on our city, is someone had a really interesting question. So I'm just going to read it. I think it's a really thoughtful and interesting question. Is there any thought to providing affordable housing that is not rental as a way of potentially allowing for lower income people to build equity in a place where real estate prices continue to escalate? Or are affordable housing advocates comfortable with what seems to be all the rental units being built? Now, that may not be addressed by zoning. That may be a broader question about sort of housing fairness in general. So I don't know if anyone, Rob or Deb or anybody's interested in talking about that. I thought that was a very thought-provoking question.
Well, you're right that zoning can't do it. So Rob, would you like to weigh in?
Well, look, I mean, it's a great question. You know, I think when we talk about true affordability, you know, the one model are the, you know, very affordable housing projects that get built from time to time. I'm on the board of 2 Life Communities, which builds affordable senior living facilities. And these are at 30% AMI and thereabouts, but they are done entirely with a mix of tax credits and HUD monies and mass housing monies. And to put together the capital for one of those projects, I guess we're doing it now with the Armory. You know, it takes years and years and years to assemble the capital stack to create those. And so it's a lot of work, but it's very impactful when you know, when those can get done. Housing, in terms of housing for sale being affordable, you're probably more into a Habitat for Humanity model. I mean, that's the model I've seen, which is really a house by house based on sweat equity and volunteer labor. But I've not seen, you know, programmatic affordable for sale housing, but doesn't mean it doesn't exist. I haven't seen anybody who's figured out how to do that on a, you know, at scale.
Yeah, and Jimmy Carter can't build every single house that we need.
Exactly. Yeah, it's a great thought though.
Yeah, no, it's a really thought-provoking thing. And obviously this conversation there's so much depth in this conversation in terms of zoning and then all the different things it opens. Oh, Susan, you had your hand up. Sorry. Go ahead.
One of the things that I've learned was that the banks don't want to lend money for purchase over 25 to 28 units. If the project gets over 25 to 28 units, they want rental. That's their model. And I've heard that from multiple developers. So that if we could manage to, because we've got smaller lots now that are developable as VC2 and VC3, we may get some of these smaller projects that could be condominiums instead of rental.
Yep.
And then the inclusionary zoning law still applies regardless if it's rental or condominium.
Yep.
The key is to open the doors.
Right.
And then, of course, you know, I know people are, some folks are nervous about the
Sure.
change that this means. I'm personally in a place where I'm welcoming it. I think, you know, it could be just great in terms of our ability to invest in and make wonderful places in our many central business districts. And we have a wonderful pattern of development in Newton where we have this opportunity to build these multiple walkable communities. And we have been squandering that opportunity by limiting the ability to build. And it's just about opening the doors, and then we have to monitor it very carefully. You know, if we get something we don't like, we'll examine why and see if there's an amend. We can always amend the ordinances. It's easier to amend them than to come up with a big plan to redo them.
Yeah, it's sad. And there's it's very sad to see a community with sort of a dead or desolate, you know, downtown and being from the Midwest originally, that certainly has happened in a lot of parts of the Midwest. It's not things that it's not nice to see. It's a very sad thing when it happens to a community. And I don't think that would happen in Newton being so close to Boston, but we still have to do what we need to do to protect it. So another line of questioning that is interesting that's coming through the chat is sort of how individual homeowners can maybe leverage some things and do some things to take advantage of some of these zoning laws. So this specific question is, how can individual homeowners take advantage of zoning laws to create accessory units or upzone their own properties to create more units for aging parents, adult children, etc.?
Well, as I briefly mentioned, we have an accessory apartment ordinance dating from the end of 2017, which I think today still is the most wide open, more progressive, if you want to use that word, in the state. We allow accessory apartments attached or within the house by right everywhere. You have to meet building code requirements, fire safety codes, but otherwise you're allowed to do it. There's dimensional requirements, but a number of people have taken advantage of that. More recently, I forget the timing, Susan, I think 2021, amended the ordinance to allow detached units. There are also dimensional requirements, and it has to do with a lot of the detached garages, carriage houses, and so forth are already too close to the lot line, sometimes right on it. So if it meets the setbacks, those can be allowed by right as well. That doesn't change with the Village Center Overlay District, but you're only allowed an accessory unit on a 1 or 2 family home. And you're only allowed one, whether it's a 1 family or a 2 family. So if you're in the VCOD and you're in the multi-residence transit district, so your neighborhood scale, and you have that colonial house, whatever, you might rather choose to have 3 full units and use the new zoning, unless you're 2 family already and you just want that accessory unit, which you could have. So it's not really relevant to this, but there already are those opportunities.
Great, that's helpful. And a really nice question just came in, because one of the things we often talk about, obviously, and think about are schools. And you mentioned, Deb, that, you know, there are some potential closures for schools, probably talking about Ward and Underwood, I'm guessing, you know, and that there's just maybe not enough families or kids to support the school. So this question is about if developers will be required to do anything special for the school. So is there anything that relates back to developers and things that they either have to fund or support, and you know, any kind of incentives or tax levies or anything of that nature?
It's indirect, but what I'll talk about is across the city, no matter whether it's by right or special permit, new development has to pay into, you won't get the connection right away. So
Yeah, it's okay.
the sewer fund.
Yeah.
It's a state law that requires, it's a pretty hefty payment based on the number of units. We have a very aggressive rehabilitation plan for our sewers that's now in its 10th year. And we probably have 5 years to go, but we're really way ahead. There's a lot of sections of the city where we've already relined the pipes and increased the capacity. So 75% of that chunk of money may be waived from the sewer system if the sewer system's in pretty good shape. It's never perfect, so they keep 25%, and the rest can go to something else. Now, in the special permit process, the city council waives that amount and asks for something else. Maybe another affordable unit, maybe something, you know, who knows? Maybe help with refurbishing a pocket park. It could be all kinds of things and that benefit the community. In the Department of Public Works and in the engineering division can waive the fee, and they will. If it's let's say it's a 20-unit development, they have to pay $400,000. I'm just making this up. Let's say that's the number. $300,000 can go into a pot for, you know, local amenities.
Right.
Of some kind.
So more is more, which gets distributed for the kids.
But again, most of these are smaller projects that are going to be by right.
Okay, totally makes sense. Okay, so since we're coming close to an end, I think if it's okay, I'm just going to pivot to a couple of Newton Upstanders questions, if that's okay. And one of the things that is pretty clear, probably compared to other meetings you both have been at recently, is that you have a receptive audience here, and you know, largely we are people who support the zoning changes, and we want to support a more inclusive Newton. So what can we do, either as our group, Newton Upstanders, or as individuals, or as other groups that are with us tonight, to be most supportive and to help, aside from obviously voting if there's a referendum or things of that nature, like what can we do to be supportive to this effort?
Well, let Rob address that.
Thank you.
I mean, I'm sort of the citizen support guy. So the first thing you can do is certainly vote for the councilors who are in favor of this zoning. And again, I mentioned voters for a vibrant Newton. If you go to the website, you'll see our endorsed candidates, which we endorse candidates in contested races. Deb's in one. She's strongly endorsed, as are, I think 7 other councilors. And so I think, voting for the right councilors is really important, particularly here in Newton, where, this is not a mayoral election year. A lot of people don't pay attention. Paying attention makes a huge difference. So that's one thing. The other thing is to sort of, I can't understate or overstate, or whatever the right word is, the kind of headwinds that Deb and her colleagues, Susan and others, are facing from the anti zoning reform folks. I mean, it's fairly brutal, and it never stops. And those folks, they show up. So we need to show up, and that means going to city council hearings, or at least getting really dialed into the issues enough that you can hold your own in a debate with your neighbor. But it's really kind of having their back as much as the anti-development folks, anti-zoning reform folks have the backs of their counselors. So it's really showing up, voting, and sort of getting more involved, and being there, as this very important initiative moves forward.
I'll also mention that VVN and some other organizations made us write long essays to multiple questions that they have online, and you can read our
Sorry
essays
about that.
to see That was part of it, yeah, it's not just your record, it's your essays. I'll mention, I don't know if any of you are from Ward 5, 6, this side as I see, actually, some of you are, but the Woburn, this is the other side of this. The Woburn Area Council is on October 12th, putting me and Councilor Wright on a stage in the Woburn Library at 7:30 to talk about zoning. And they've set it up very much like a debate. We each get 5 minutes, and then there's going to be questions culled from the audience. So at every other thing I've been at, so not a Zoom meeting like this, but a meeting that where explained zoning to folks at the Unitarian Society in West Newton, there have been protests with people holding signs and placards and then coming into the room. And, in that case, it was not disruptive, but in another case, in another community, it was. And, so the questions are of a whole different quality than what I've heard tonight. You're welcome to attend. Maybe your question will get asked, but they're going to sort the questions and decide which ones they're going to ask. So,
certainly, friendly audience members is always a good thing, regardless, right?
Yeah, I love a challenging question, but not a mean question.
Yeah,
particularly,
yeah, getting yelled at in your face is never a good thing, right? Okay, so thank you so much, and we really appreciate this. I know zoning maybe isn't the top of everybody's mind, but of course it is really important, and people who do know about it know how important it is to our city. So if you could just put all the people out there who are not tuned in to zoning, and maybe they're friends of ours, or we want to let them know why it's so important. Do you have a nice little elevator speech, a couple sentences that we can say to friends to get them interested in this issue? For us, it would be, of course, about racial justice, but is there what's a good one-line zinger, Deb, that we can use?
Well, we're trying to open the doors to enable our city to grow more naturally, and doing it in a way that will bring economic diversity. And until you have that, you're not going to have an inclusive community.
Thank you. That's beautiful. Laura, anything else we'd like to say? We, if you don't know Newton Upstanders, we have your email now, so you can't avoid us. No, I'm kidding. We may ask you to sign up for our email, but we won't pester you unless you agree to do so. So we're happy to have you. We will continue to talk about this issue through a lens of social justice and other aspects that are important to our group. And we're always looking for new people to get involved with what we're doing. So we welcome everyone to come and join us. Laura, anything you'd want to add?
No, just thank you so much. And
Thank you.
there were so many great questions in the chat, and also a lot of good resources shared. So we're going to capture all that. I hope it's okay, Deb, if we are able to share these slides with folks afterwards.
Absolutely.
Great.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
And we have so many great
we'll
questions.
send something out to everyone who
Yeah.
registered after. And please, if you haven't already signed up to get a Newton for Everyone yard sign, I got mine
Yes.
today, and it's great, and I'm really happy to have it there. If you don't know that much about Newton Upstanders, please check us out, and also we'd love it for you to sign our values. So we really are excited for this work ahead, and we're so glad that you came tonight.
Yes, thank you. And we'll send an email out to folks who attended with some links. And if you so choose, you can sign up for other communications from us if you haven't already. Thank you to our city councilors. We appreciate you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks
Thank
so much.
you.
Great to meet you all.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Good night.
Thanks again, Deb.
Oh, thank you.
You
I
know,
thought that was okay, huh?
yeah, I'm gonna stop the, actually, let me just stop the recording for a second here. Deb,
Yes.
one thing